Patrick Johnston, welcome. Here we are enjoying the great outdoors before the rains arrive yet again. Interesting week for the Canucks, was it not? Draft lottery, it didn't seem to me like there was the hype going into it. Canuck fans obviously making jokes about the fact that never picked first, that the hockey gods don't smell them. But I think because we didn't have the glittering prize at the top end of the draft, there wasn't as much angst when the Canucks kind of stayed where they were at 9.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, it was one of those ones where, like, as I was getting ready for it in the sort of day ahead or whatever, I just had to ask someone. I was like, "What time's the actual lottery?" Like, that's how little it was kind of on my radar. Um, yeah, and I mean, the funny story, of course, for once, they didn't actually fall back. They're just in the position they started in. So that itself, I think, feels like a win.
Sorry, just trying to avoid a large truck passing the travails, as we were talking about before, the travails of recording from home and not in a professional studio. And of course, whoever accused us of being anything professional.
And you're in a tiki bar. I mean, that sort of says everything, doesn't it? You're just keeping up with Rick Dollywall.
Tiki bar.
Tiki bar, tiki bar, tiki bar. What did I say? Dollywall gave me a hard time about how I said something the other day. Yeah. Tiki barber, tiki bar. Anyway, there we go.
But not nine's curious. Obviously there are exceptions where you will get a player who can come in and contribute right away. Mm-hmm. The Canucks next year should be getting Vasily Podkolzin, their next great prospect that they haven't seen. Of course, he had a contract situation that prevented him from coming earlier.
Right.
But at 9, are you thinking of a pick that's a year away, 2 years away? I mean, again, the great unknown is that we didn't see a full junior hockey season.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is that even if they were in a position to sort of pick a game ready prospect, if you will, I think the reality is, especially if you're drafting kids, like people are kind of talking about someone like Mason McTavish being the kind of player that might be available. He was supposed to be playing for Peterborough this year. There was no OHL this year. So, and even kids who played in the dub, I mean, obviously it was good they got to play, and, kudos to all the teams involved in WHL for pulling that off, even if they did have a couple little outbreaks. They played a quarter of a season, and physically these kids will have made some development. I've got cottonwood floating around me, of course. But yeah, I think the reality is that there's just not going to be a player that steps in the lineup next year, even though we clearly can see, and this was something that came up in my discussions with people looking at essentially the Canucks versus the Avalanche and what the Canucks need, to have a hope of becoming a team like the Avalanche. They need, another really true top end young player, especially if you look at sort of how the window is probably going to pass Bo Horvat by as a sort of top end forward. And it's just not going to be there. I think that's the reality. You're getting a kid that's going to be, maybe he'll be ready in a year. Sometimes you'll see that happen with first round players. But realistically, 2 years. I mean, Vasily Podkolzin's coming in, and everyone says he's going to step into the lineup and be a huge factor. So I think the reality is that this isn't a player that's going to be in the lineup till like 2023.
I always find the draft both usually, well, let's just say 3 of the big sports, in hockey, NFL, and right. Basketball as well. I always find the conversation fascinating about best player available. To me, it's an easy but lazy answer to say you're interested in the best player available.
Yeah.
Clearly, if you have a pick and you already have, let's say, 4 offensive defensemen, and the best player available is an offensive defenseman, but you're bereft of other options.
Right.
Sometimes I think that's very cliche to say that. Although again, if that asset is very good, you can always look at moving them. But if you were to look at this and say, what are the Canucks' positions of need? So whether it's first round, second round, third round, where do you see them needing to stock up?
Center. That's just not there. They traded away Adam Gaudette, Tyler Madden, who, we'll still see. Obviously, he still has to make it. But Tyler Madden was sort of, I think, another option there, certainly when he was drafted. He's not there. there's a handful of guys that, could make it as like a fourth line center, but no one's suggesting that Carson Vogt, Artem Kazmar, Dmitry Zolodeyev, any of those guys are going to be anything more, like I said, than a fourth line center. Arvid Kosmar, sorry. That's just the truth, is that there's nothing there. They need a guy that's going to push up the lineup. Elias Pettersson, thankfully, is still young. He's just really going to just start coming into his prime now, which is great. And Bo Horvat, he's still a mature player, but in terms of production, the history has said this starts falling off. He's about to turn 26, and that's when things start to fall off. He's still going to be a very useful player. Don't get me wrong, but they really need another young blue chip talent at center coming up. Obviously they do need more defensemen. At least they have Quinn Hughes. You can do a lot with a player like that. And Nate Schmidt. Nate Schmidt, I think, assuming he stays, Nate Schmidt is a player that they had high hopes for, who had been a very good player in Vegas and just had a difficult season. But it was a tough year for everyone, on the ice, off the ice. It was just, and it would have been, I'm sure, a difficult transition for a player like that. And so, he's a guy that helps you to some degree. Obviously, he's not a Quinn Hughes type. He's not a potential number one, but he's certainly a guy that can play heavy minutes going forward, a kind of defenseman they need. Moves well, that kind of thing. And then, of course, in goal, Thatcher Demko, for now is the guy, and Mike DiPietro is going to be there one day as well. So, yeah, to me, center is the clear position. Just on your point of kind of like, if they were overloaded at one position or another, that itself is an argument for trading back. And that doesn't happen as much as I think we'd expect to happen in the NHL for whatever reason. I think partly because NHL teams do recognize the fact is that because you have to dress 18 skaters every night, like that's a lot of holes to fill. And so you can make it work. And, in the end, you want to see how your prospects do. I think they also know that not every prospect's going to work out quite the way they want them to work out, even in the first round, even towards the top. But, in a position like that, it's happened before. The Canucks have been in a position, it hasn't happened, but, certainly the 2016 with Ulevy on the table at number 5, a player that, I think Jim Benny really liked, a player I think that most observers felt would have been there later. There were certainly, I think, offers for them to have moved back. They probably could have still gotten Ulevy and something else. They didn't do it. They stuck with it. And, even put Colton, don't get me wrong, I think it has proven to be a great draft pick. They executed that really well. But there was an opportunity there, I believe, on the table as well, that they could have actually fallen back a couple spots in the first round. You would have gained a few other items. If it had been me, I might have done that. But in the end, they did swing for the fences with the pick. It was a pick that most people didn't expect. Ben Kuzma and I were joking about this the other day. We were talking about looking forward to this draft and sort of some of the stuff that we're thinking about doing. And, Ben was so heavily involved in writing about our draft preview stuff that year. The one guy he didn't end up writing about was Vasily Kolzin, because he just is like, there's no way the Canucks are going to pick a Russian. And, of course, then they went and did. So lesson learned, I think, for us. But certainly, yeah, I think a center, that's certainly the discussion. It'll be interesting how it shakes out. I think Kent Johnston, who's a local kid and is a defenseman, is another possibility there. But we'll see how it shakes out.
You mentioned trades. So I think, obviously, if it's top 3 pick, even in a sketchy year, there's going to be pressure on the organization to keep that pick. And a lot of debate around the GM in terms of, like, because drafting is a strong suit, have they given away especially mid-round picks too cheaply?
Right.
Do you think there's any? So I know the name Seth Jones was out there. He's going to be available. Doesn't want to re-sign Columbus.
Yeah.
Do you see a scenario where they could trade the first pick, or is this something where, as an organization that values drafting, that there's too much risk there to go 2 years without a number 1?
I think this is not the year to go trading your first round pick, and not because. Not because whether or not there's high quality players at the top end of the draft is kind of immaterial. They need players. That's the simple fact. They did well drafting 2017, 2018, 2019. Some of those players are already in the lineup. The 2019 draft, really could turn into something special. But there's just not a lot of top end talent coming into the system. And that's just a simple truth. I mean, Jack Rathbone could turn out to be a really, really, really nice pick out of that draft. But we have to see it. We have to see him execute. I mean, we saw a bit of him this season, and lots of good things to see there, and certainly a smart player, a player who's got a immense skill set, the kind of guy that you really think will probably figure it out and become the complete player, the complete sort of number 3, number 4 defenseman the Canucks really need him to be. That's a good thing, but they simply can't afford not to keep adding to their cupboard. Last year's draft, they only picked 4 guys. They didn't pick until the 4th round. There's a lot of people that are really already skeptical about most of that draft. I mean, Yoni Yermo, a very sort of athletic, big kid who can skate, but real concerns about sort of his ability to process the game, think about the game, really actually play at the level that they're going to need him to play. Jackson Kunz, someone was saying to me, like, all the same skating issues as Ethan Keppen, and perhaps less skilled. And then, Jacob Truscott, I think people were pretty down on that pick right from the start. It smacked a little bit of, well, he's a defenseman, he can skate a little bit, he's going to Michigan, therefore, he's going to be great. Well, we'll see. He's still got a couple more years, but the only pick that anyone really tries to sort of talk about in that draft, really, of sort of any kind of going, this might be interesting, is Victor Persson, who I talked to this week and said he's hoping to still end up in Kamloops next season. An interesting Swedish kid, but he was a 7th round pick for a reason, right? Like the truth is that the 2020 draft has a really strong chance of not turning out any players. And we that's an old story with the Canucks. There are drafts from 15 years ago. In the 2002 draft, they picked 12 players and they got a handful of NHL games out of that. The 2007 draft, the Patrick White draft, they literally didn't get a single NHL player out of it. And that which all was under the sort of head guidance of Ron DeLorme, who apparently has the ear of Jim Benning again. People point to, well, he drafted this guy and this guy. I'm like, yeah, that's fine, but the overall picture is terrible. And that's the constant reminder here, is that, the Canucks did a really good job for about 3 years. They've kind of stocked the cupboard, but you have to keep putting things in it. And that's the other lesson from the Colorado Avalanche, is like, they had a window before, right? They had, when Nathan MacKinnon was drafted, the first window was McKinnon, there was Duchesne, there was Ryan O'Reilly, Gabe Landeskog was supposed to be part of that, but like there's only 2 guys left from that sort of original group of players, and they've completely reset on what they did. They moved on from those other guys and they completely reset, and they kept drafting. They still have to win the Stanley Cup. Like, people aren't wrong when they point that out, but the whole point is, how do you become a contender? And how the Avalanche became a contender was they made some really, they sort of made a choice. They said, nope, this isn't working. We're going in a different direction. They empowered. They brought in, obviously, a famous former player who clearly had some eye for how to build a team, empowered some smart people on staff, and were really aggressive in finding young talent. And now that young talent's coming to pay off. And, they're going to lose some guys in free agency, but hey, they've got all these defensemen coming through. They've got Bowen Byram, they got Connor Timmins. Like, those are guys that aren't even really playing yet. So the idea that somehow, you can just sort of do it with a couple of good drafts, it just doesn't work that way. You need to keep coming, because, to go back to your earlier question, at some point you end up with too many of one thing, and maybe you need to fix another thing, and you can shift things around. And
so if people haven't connected the dots, the reason you're talking about the Avalanche is a story that you have done, which we'll finish up talking about here.
Yeah.
I will touch on a couple of points here. Number one, you talk about the Patrick White draft, and they didn't get a single NHL player, but they did turn Patrick White into Christian Ehrhoff,
right,
who then helped them get to 2011. Yeah. The argument can be made about last year's draft rule if they don't get a player out of it, but they still got JT Miller, which maybe accelerates your window a little bit. Can also close it faster on the other end when you don't have those picks. But so in light of that, and you look at, so they brought in Nate Schmidt, they brought in JT Miller. They are seemingly still in love with veteran leadership in the locker room, even though we haven't seen that necessarily translate yet into any sort of playoff success, barring last year's mini bump. So ultimately, Patrick, let's look at this and let's ignore the tiresome Twitter argument, which seems to string up all the time, and I don't even want to get into that. But
I hear some tweets coming in right now.
That have been nonstop all morning. And people should go and check out your article. The conversation was not like, are the Canucks following the blueprint of the Colorado Avalanche? It's more, Jim Benning said they were 2 years away for wanting to compete for the Stanley Cup. That's not making the playoffs. That's not hoping that the LA Kings can pull a miracle of Manchester and knock off the Edmonton Oilers as they did, way back in '82. Right. This is about taking care of your own business and about having to go through teams like Colorado. The Canucks were up against this. They should have won the Cup in 2011, as we know, the way circumstances were, but they had to go through the Chicago Blackhawks, and they did it that year. And they couldn't get over the finish line. So the issue is not, how do the Canucks become the Colorado Avalanche? The issue is, how do the Vancouver Canucks get through the Avalanche? How do they compete with them, or the Vegas Golden Knights, or whoever else is at the top of the division? We picked the Avs because right now they look like the class of the West. So how do the Canucks, for those who haven't read your article yet, how do the Canucks look to be on a timetable to be able to take on the top teams in the West?
Well, I think, I had one optimistic take, which was 3 years. If you do this, this, and this, and get some luck, the most sort of consensus was, realistically, you're 5 years away. You're going to have to find, like I said, you're going to have to find you really do need to find some sort of really high-end young forward. It's just that's simple, because, if you're looking at everything else they need, they need a high-end forward. They're missing basically right now, properly almost an entire third line. They're missing a couple defensemen. There's pieces there that every good trying to become great team in the league has right now. I mean, just look at the Lightning, the team that won the Stanley Cup last year. Look at what made the St. Louis Blues so strong, that incredible defense, with a goaltender obviously playing on the top of his game, and really deep forwards. Look at many ways this year's Winnipeg team, maybe not the best example, but Winnipeg's team from a couple of years ago, the team that went all the way to the conference final, like deep defense, really solid group of forwards, teams that play fast, they make things happen. Every line makes things happen. And that's the simple truth, is right now the Canucks just don't have that kind of depth. They obviously have a first line that, when it's on its game, is playing great. But right now they're in a position where people are talking about, to kind of make it all kind of work and potentially really maybe slide a little bit forward, is you're all of a sudden taking JT Miller. I mean, I've made this argument before. I think there is a case to be made to put JT Miller on your third line, but that is sacrificing the Lotto line, which 2 seasons ago was one of the best lines in the NHL. And if you're trying to build everything, you need to have people pushing things down. Well, you would ideally like to mean that because JT Miller's position has been taken by a better player. Maybe that works out as Vasily Podkolzin, but then who else? Who plays with JT Miller? You know what I mean? Like, it just starts.
Well, I think that's a fascinating debate in terms of how you build your team. Do you want the one devastating line, or do you want to spread that impact, throughout your lineup? My own personal preference is to keep the top line together, and try and find some other one who's not a Jay Beagle to get to that position. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the
there's different ways to do it, different philosophies, right?
That in the end is the lesson forever. That people love point. I think people should point to the Oilers, because the Oilers have had, they have this two great players. The problem is they didn't do the rest. They finally, the last 2 seasons have been huge disappointments in the playoffs. Teams that really looked like maybe it had turned itself around, was really pointing in the right direction, then hit the playoffs. And then the problem is that once McDavid and Draisaitl are off the ice and you're playing other good teams, sometimes, you just need more. You need more.
Yeah, I agree. But, you look at the Lightning 2 years ago, couldn't get by Columbus, and everyone like John Tortorella, coaching genius, and another disappointment for the Lightning. And then they take that and learn from it. Right. Obviously, you look at salary cap issues kick into, again, that's something to be worried of with the Blues. You look at what they had to do with that great defense, right? So but you already have your ring at that point.
I think your point about the Lightning still stands what I was saying before, though, is that at the end of the day, the Lightning did have depth, and they were, I think, smartly said, we're not blowing this up. We're going to see how. I mean, if they hadn't won the Stanley Cup last year, I think they would smartly been like, we need to go a new direction, which I think is where the Leafs find themselves at.
And where the Leafs find themselves out, and where, as you've pointed out, where the Avs were. Yeah. To you still pick and choose which key pieces but you also need a bit of a blow up. So
it's that sort of, you know, sometimes you just got to accept you have a bad hand and fold, right? Like that's the lesson from poker, right? Just because you are holding face cards doesn't mean you keep playing. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll leave it there for now, just because we've probably babbled enough, and also I believe it's starting to rain. And I'd rather not have, it must be headed your way soon, buddy. It literally just started here. yeah, not too far away. All right, my friend, thank you so much. If you haven't read Patrick's article yet comparing the Canucks and what they have to do to become an elite team in the West, go check it out. We'll have more pre-draft coverage and analysis of the roster coming up in the coming weeks.